Wednesday, 14th of December 2016, 3:47 p.m., Heathrow Airport. A suitcase from an international flight appears on a carousel it should never have reached. 3 years later, almost to the day, a man in uniform arrives for work 3 hours early, driving a vehicle that grants him access to every terminal at Britain's busiest airport. 2 different cases, 2 separate criminal networks, both connected by one silent advantage: corrupt airport staff helping cocaine move across UK borders. They didn't just work behind the scenes, they were the operation. And what happened next exposed a pipeline worth millions. This is the story of how traffickers turned airport access into a £6 million cocaine route, with insiders who knew exactly what to do. Welcome to UK True Crime Files. I'm your name, and today we're diving deep into one of the most brazen smuggling conspiracies ever uncovered at Heathrow. Let's get into it. Joyce Agyemang JNR knew Heathrow better than most passengers ever would. As a British Airways baggage handler, he had full airside clearance, the kind of access that depends entirely on trust. He could drive tugs across runways, move baggage containers between terminals, and operate in restricted zones without question. And it was that trust he chose to exploit. Investigators later discovered JNR didn't just show up for his shifts. He often appeared at Heathrow on days he wasn't even scheduled to work. Once airside, he faced few questions. Security procedures allowed him to move freely between aircraft stands, baggage zones, and carousels. He'd climb onto an electric tug, collect a container, and deliver it wherever he chose. To colleagues, it looked routine, but every movement was deliberate. JNR knew exactly which flights carried contraband, and he wasn't working alone. Muhammad Ali, another baggage handler based in Slough, became his right-hand man. Together they formed the insider link the criminal network desperately needed. They weren't low-level helpers slipping a bag through. They were central figures controlling how and when luggage bypassed scrutiny. The strength of the operation lay in knowledge. JNR knew when to act, which containers to open, and how to avoid suspicion. Ali ensured the diversions happened seamlessly. To outside eyes, it looked legitimate. In reality, it was the foundation of a system that allowed tons of drugs to enter the country, hidden in plain sight at Britain's busiest airport. But the baggage handlers were only part of the structure. Around them, a wider network worked to keep the system running smoothly. At the center of communication was Priya Mongra, JNR's brother-in-law. He acted as the go-between, keeping handlers in contact with organizers and ensuring timings were exact. Whenever a flight arrived from Brazil, phone records showed JNR was in near constant contact with Mongra. Calls placed before, during, and after consignments landed. Then there was Wilfred Owusu, based in Stoke Newington. He managed the couriers, the people who would physically collect the bags and carry them out of Heathrow. Owusu's role was to make the system appear normal. Couriers wouldn't arrive on the same flights as the drugs. Instead, they flew in on domestic routes from Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, or Aberdeen. It was a deliberate tactic. Domestic arrivals faced no customs checks. When they walked into the baggage hall, they were treated like any other passenger returning from within the UK. The couriers themselves were varied. Donovan Bull, 45, from Clapham Moses Awapetu, 38, of no fixed address. Felicia Kufior, 66, from Bedford Francisca Archer, 26, from Stamford Hill. Each was given precise instructions before their trip. Their phones would buzz with a message, a photograph of the bag they were meant to pick up, the color, shape, tags, and labels attached. There could be hundreds of suitcases circling the carousel, but they knew exactly which one to lift. Once the baggage handlers had done their part, it was almost effortless. The couriers would step off a domestic flight, walk to the carousel, collect the pre-identified case, and roll it out through the exit. But the network extended further still. Michael Sutherland, 48, from South Norwood, was one of the main organizers overseeing distribution once the drugs left Heathrow. He was supported by Marco Agoro, 52, from Chafford 100 in Essex, and Damien Goodhall, 30, from Tooting, who liaised directly with JNR on collections and handovers. Supporting them was Aziz Abdul, 37, of no fixed abode, a trusted friend of Owusu who ensured couriers reached their destinations and logistics ran smoothly. Alongside him was Leona Townsend Bartley, 32, who worked behind the scenes booking flights and hotels for couriers, ensuring they were in place at the right time for each collection. This wider circle rarely appeared at Heathrow itself, but their fingerprints were everywhere. Phone logs, surveillance footage, and meetings across London linked them back to the baggage handlers on the tarmac. Together, the 13 formed a complete pipeline, a network where each role mattered, each movement was timed, and every person was essential. The route began thousands of miles away in Rio de Janeiro. Ordinary-looking suitcases were slipped into the hold of British Airways flights bound for Heathrow. They weren't placed there by accident. Corrupt staff on the Brazilian side were also part of the conspiracy, loading cocaine into bags after security checks had been cleared. Every time it was the same routine. Drugs packed into standard luggage, sealed and tagged like any other passenger's belongings. To ensure the plan ran smoothly, details of the bags were sent ahead to London. Photographs were shared through BlackBerry Messenger, showing not just the suitcase itself, but the distinctive labels and markings attached to it. By the time the flight crossed the Atlantic, the handlers in the UK already knew exactly what to look for and what to do. For months, the system worked, but in 2015, a single suitcase sparked doubt. A bag tagged from Rio de Janeiro suddenly appeared on a carousel reserved for domestic arrivals. Border Force officers flagged it immediately. It didn't belong there. The sight of a Rio-tagged case in the wrong hall was enough to raise internal alerts. That anomaly triggered closer monitoring. Border Force began tracking Heathrow flights from Rio, watching for any repeat of the pattern. The National Crime Agency was brought in and surveillance of specific flights was ordered. Over time, the same clues kept surfacing: identical flight times, the same weekday routes, and bags that consistently weighed more than average passenger luggage. What had looked at first like a one-off mistake began to appear as part of a larger pattern, one that pointed to an organized operation running directly through Heathrow's systems. Once suspicions were confirmed, the National Crime Agency launched an operation to expose what was really happening at Heathrow. It would take 18 months. The focus wasn't just on the baggage, but on the people who had access to it. Investigators began mapping every movement of the handlers suspected of being on the inside. CCTV became a key tool. Footage from the tarmac and restricted areas showed Joyce Jhurry and Muhammad Ali in places they had no official reason to be. They were caught driving baggage tugs and entering secure zones, even on days when they weren't rostered to work. That level of freedom was the advantage they'd exploited. But it also provided the first hard evidence of abuse. Phone data began to reveal the next layer. Priya Mongra's call logs placed him in contact with numbers in Brazil at crucial points. He was also in constant communication with Jhurry. Each spike in calls matched the arrival of a Rio flight, linking the ground team to the international supply line. Meanwhile, the NCA intercepted encrypted traffic. Messages between Wilfred Owusu and his courier team were decrypted, showing how photos of luggage and detailed collection instructions were being passed around. But the investigation didn't stop at the airport. Officers followed the network across London. Covert surveillance teams filmed meetings at cafes, on street corners and outside homes. One team captured Joyce Jhurry meeting with Damien Goodhall in a public space. The surveillance operation was patient, precise. Until 15th December 2016. That afternoon, investigators inside Heathrow spotted something that changed everything. Felicia Kufor, a 66-year-old courier, lingered near the domestic carousel. She wasn't acting like a passenger waiting for her own bag. Her eyes scanned for something specific, a suitcase that should never have been there. For the NCA, it was the slip they'd been waiting for. Every detail of her behavior matched the intelligence they'd built over 18 months. In that moment, surveillance crossed into certainty. The network wasn't just suspected, it was visible in real time, unfolding inside Britain's busiest airport. She was intercepted at the baggage hall by Border Force. That single act tipped the balance. The quiet monitoring phase was over. The next move would no longer be to watch, but to strike. By December 2016, the National Crime Agency had built its case. 6 consignments of cocaine had already been intercepted. more than 100 kilos of high-purity Class A drugs, along with 44 kilos of cannabis. Each seizure added to the picture, but investigators knew some shipments had almost certainly slipped through. The priority was to bring the network down before any more did. The final move was timed with precision. On 14th of December 2016, the NCA staged a series of coordinated dawn raids across London and the southeast. Surveillance units had already tracked the gang's routines. That morning, they struck. At Heathrow, Joyce Jhurry was arrested on the ground he'd once moved so freely. When officers confronted him, he didn't resist. Instead, he admitted a sense of relief, telling them he was glad they'd come. His colleague, Muhammad Ali, was taken from his home in Slough. In Thornton Heath, Prior Mongra was detained. Elsewhere in London, arrests were made simultaneously. Damien Goodhall was pulled in Marco Agoro, based in Chafford 100, Essex, was seized. Michael Sutherland, a senior organizer in South Norwood, was detained. Wilfred Owusu was arrested. The raids were timed to coincide with a planned pickup. It meant the arrests weren't abstract. Police caught the gang in the very act of trying to move a consignment. After 18 months of surveillance, the network was dismantled in hours. When the case finally reached court, the scale of the conspiracy was laid bare. Judges at Kingston and Suffolk Crown Courts handed down sentences that reflected both the weight of the drugs and the breach of trust involved. At the center, Joyce Agyemang Jhurry was jailed for 16 years. His colleague Muhammad Ali received 15 years. Those who organized from outside the baggage halls faced even longer terms. Wilfred Owusu, 20 years. Michael Sutherland, 20 years. Marco Agoro, 14, 1-2 years. Priya Mongra, 13 years and 6 months. Damien Goodhall, 11, 1-2 years. Aziz Abdul, 9 years and 6 months. Moses Awapetu, 6 years and 9 months. Donovan Bull, 6 years. Francisca Archer, 6 years and 6 months. Leona Townsend Bartley, 6 years. Felicia Kufuor, convicted alongside them. In total, the gang received 139 years of prison time. The Heathrow network was dismantled. But corruption inside Britain's busiest airport didn't end there. A few years later, a new story began to unfold. Jund Dar, a 47-year-old security manager from Slough, turned up 3 hours before his shift was due to begin. He was already in uniform, carrying the authority that came with his role. Dar's position gave him access to areas few could reach. Using his clearance, he collected a secure airport vehicle. With it, he could cross airside zones, drive directly to the stands, and move freely between terminals. That morning, he headed towards Terminal 2, blending into the flow of staff preparing for incoming flights. On paper, nothing about his movements looked unusual. Managers often checked operations across terminals. Vehicles were a routine part of their job. Yet Dar's purpose that morning had nothing to do with security. His target was a single flight arriving from Bogota, Colombia. On board were 2 couriers, Michael Williams, 39, and Jessica Waldron, 38, both from Dudley in the West Midlands. They'd been recruited to carry cocaine hidden in their checked luggage. For them, the plan was simple: land in London, meet the insider, and hand over the bags. Dar's role was to make it possible. He was there to meet them the moment they stepped off the flight, using his uniform and vehicle as cover. The plan began long before the flight touched down at Heathrow. In Bogota, Williams and Waldron checked in like any other passengers. Their bags contained what they believed to be 22 kilos of high-purity cocaine, packed carefully into blocks and concealed among their belongings. It was a route cartels had used before, but this time, the operation didn't go as they expected. Colombian authorities, working in partnership with the UK's National Crime Agency, were already watching. Acting on intelligence, they pulled the couple's bags aside before they even left Bogota Airport. Inside, they found the drugs, with a street value of around £2 million. Rather than seizing the couriers on the spot, the officers tried something different. They swapped the cocaine for identical wooden blocks, cut and shaped to match the size and weight of the original packages, and sent them on to London. It was a calculated tactic. By allowing the flight to continue, the NCA could track the smugglers' movements inside Heathrow and monitor who came to meet them. If the drugs had simply been seized in Bogota, the couriers would have been lost, and the insiders still hidden. The operation went through as normal. What none of them knew was that the case they were about to hand over no longer carried cocaine, but the evidence that would bring the operation down. While Dar waited at Heathrow, the couriers weren't moving blindly. Their instructions came from two organizers based in the West Midlands: Rufford Davis, 55, from Dudley, and David Farquharson, 53, from Westbury. Their role was to guide the couriers at every step, from Bogota to the arrivals hall. Both men relied on encrypted messaging apps to pass instructions. The couriers' phones were monitored as part of the surveillance operation. Once they landed, their communications were captured in real time. After the arrests, the phones themselves were seized and analyzed. The evidence revealed a telling detail. When Waldron landed in London, she received two identical screenshots from Davis and Farquharson. The messages contained precise directions for the handover, who she would meet, where to go, and how to avoid attention. It wasn't just communication that tied them in. The NCA built a picture of their involvement across the operation. Phone records and cell site analysis placed them in contact with Dar at key moments. The duplication of instructions was a mistake that strengthened the case against them. It showed they weren't loosely connected players, they were part of the core structure. For the NCA, the messages were crucial. They didn't just reveal the plan for Waldron and Williams' arrival, they exposed the link between the couriers on the ground, the insider waiting at Heathrow, and the organizers pulling strings from the Midlands. Davis and Farquharson weren't at the airport when the bags landed, but their fingerprints were all over the operation. The plan unfolded exactly as the organizers intended. After their long flight from Bogota, Michael Williams and Jessica Waldron collected their bags and walked out into the arrivals hall. The instructions they'd received led them straight to June Dar. In uniform and carrying the authority of a security manager, he was waiting to intercept them. Dar guided the pair away from the main concourse, steering them into a toilet area, out of sight of surveillance cameras. It was here the transfer was meant to happen quietly. Waldron and Williams handed over their bags, still believing they carried £2 million worth of cocaine. Dar loaded them into his vehicle, a secure airport car that gave him access across the terminal and beyond. But before he could leave the building, the operation ended. NCA officers moved in, surrounding Dar as he tried to drive away with the luggage. The bags, swapped in Bogota for wooden blocks, became the evidence that tied him directly to the smuggling attempt. At the same time, Williams and Waldron were intercepted as they made for the exits. Border Force officers stopped them before they could leave the airport, bringing the couriers into custody. Both were charged with attempting to import Class A drugs. The arrests didn't end at Heathrow. In the days that followed, coordinated raids were carried out across the West Midlands. Rufford Davis and David Farquharson were taken into custody. Their devices were seized, their communications decrypted, and their financial records examined. In a single coordinated move, the NCA had captured every link in the chain: the couriers, the insider at Heathrow, and the organizers. The intercepted messages, the seized mobile phones, and the footage from inside the airport left no room for denial. On 4th of August 2023, at Kingston Crown Court, the conspiracy reached its conclusion. Prosecutors laid out the case against the men who had turned Heathrow's systems to their advantage. The judge told the court that Dar's actions represented a gross betrayal of trust, a calculated abuse of privilege that undermined public confidence in airport security. Organized crime groups, he said, relied on insiders like him, and without them, their systems would collapse. June Dar, 47, of Randolph Road in Slough, received the longest sentence, 16 years in prison. The organizers behind the couriers followed: Rufford Davis, 55, of Pitfield Road in Dudley; 14 years David Farquharson, 53, of Waterside Avenue in Westbury; 2 years the couriers themselves were dealt with earlier. In 2022, also at Kingston Crown Court, Michael Williams, 39, and Jessica Waldron, 38, both from Dudley, admitted attempting to import Class A drugs. Each was sentenced to 6 years and 8 months. At the end of the hearing, the NCA repeated its warning that insider corruption remains one of the greatest threats to UK border security. Heathrow and Border Force were praised for their cooperation. 2 separate networks, 2 different eras, but the same vulnerability exploited. trust. Airport staff with access, authority, and opportunity turned into the very people meant to stop the drugs from getting through. What do you think about these cases and the sentences each individual received? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to UK True Crime Files, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.